Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I think we'll kick this off now. So I'm Charlie Paradise. I head up the sustainability practice here at Smart Design, and on behalf of myself and my co-host Peter Schwartz, I'm very pleased to welcome you to our virtual Smart Salon, Closing the Loop. This salon came about because recyclability is a very big deal for many of our clients. A lot of them have made ESG goals and really need to meet them. And they're really pushing towards using materials that are recyclable, maybe compostable, maybe biodegradable. But just because a material is theoretically recyclable doesn't mean that it will be. And to close the loop, we need systems in place to collect materials, sort materials, process materials, and also an end market who wants materials. And then on top of all of that, there's education and encouragement that's needed to make it all happen. So the question is, how do we as designers and brand owners, brand managers, design products in an environmentally responsible manner? So we have three guests joining us today who know a lot more about this subject than I do, and I'm delighted to have them here. So I'll ask them all to introduce themselves now and talk a bit about a project they're working on. So Fiona, over to you.
Hi everyone, I'm Fiona from a group called Hilo. So we all have some kind of material background, and we work within the sphere of products and sustainable systems, circular business models. This is an example of a project that we worked on that's soon to come to market, which was in the particular market where it is, it's worth many millions of dollars a year. And so they were really looking for materials that would allow it to work within the systems that exist, both pulp and paper and compostable. So involved material research, some systems thinking, and some redesign as well.
Were you able to solve it, or is it still very much in progress?
It's in progress. Yeah, it's possible, but yes, yeah, it's in progress.
Very cool. Thanks very much, Fiona. Keith, if you wouldn't mind giving yourself a quick introduction.
Of the Recycling Partnership. We're a US-based nonprofit. We're about 7 years old, and we were formed because I think we had the same question that you had. Why is it so hard to make this system work for me? And so today I'm going to talk about a new tool that we've developed all around design. It's called Plastic IQ. This was with support from Walmart. We partnered with Systemic, a UK-based group, to really get to the heart of trade-offs between design. I'm going to talk about that, but also looking forward to digging into some other resources. And my hope today, when we end this conversation, you'll know where to look to get the tools you need to be more effective in your job.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And Tom, over to you.
Fantastic. Just real pleasure to be here. So my name is Tom. I'm the founder and CEO of TerraCycle, and we are a global waste management company focusing on how do we help move from linear to circular systems by collecting and recycling hard to recycle things, then integrating waste back into products. And then what you see here is our newest platform, Loop, which is focused on how do we help shift from single use or disposable consumption to more reusable consumption. And really looking forward to the discussion today.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. A little housekeeping now for everyone attending. At the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A box. Please use that for any questions you have for our panelists. Peter will be keeping tabs, and he will submit them to people towards the end of the salon. There's also a chat window just next to that. There's the chat icon. If you have any comments, any thoughts throughout you want to share with the group, please post them there. And any panelists, if you have links you want to share with the attendees, please post them there as well. The session is being recorded. There's going to be a summary along with links posted in a week or two's time on the Smart Design website, and we will send you email as that comes up. So let's begin. So I'll start with a bit of an overview, a bit broad, asking about what people are doing in this world. So Keith, can you tell us a bit about the state of recycling in the US today? Kind of what's its reach, what's working? And are the things we're putting in the recycling bins actually getting recycled?
You bet. I just popped into the chat a report that we just released. It's about the US system and what is it going to take to help it level up to make sure that we are reaching everyone with equity. And it's also ready to respond to and be part of how design intersects with that which is recycling and waste management. So that report will highlight for you all the gains that we think are there to be had if we can get the system working in tip-top shape. But where are we right now? Where we are right now is that half of Americans don't have equitable access to recycling, and we think that's a challenge. And we know that we're on the cusp of making more things recyclable, but that won't happen without investment. So if you're wondering what's up with the recycling system today, can I trust that it's going to do what I need it to do? The answer is, for the majority of traditional packaging, the answer is yes. When we get into things that are more emerging packaging formats, even things like polypropylene cups, it's in many places yes. So I'd love to dig in today to really make sure that everyone can understand where the clear paths are and where do we need to do more work to bridge between the design world and the infrastructure world to make sure that you're not guessing, no one's accidentally greenwashing, and instead we're designing for a circular system. My goal is to get to a point that soon all designers will know, even before they get to work, if they put something out into the marketplace, that it will either be linear or circular. What does that mean? Well, right now, a linear system is that you can make something and then hope for the best. I hope this gets recycled or turned into something new. But if it doesn't, that's linear. It ends in a landfill. A circular system is one that, from the concept of design, you already know how it can become nutritive, become part of a system to turn into something new. That's what the report is about. That's what Plastic IQ is about. And that's what I think you as designers should be calling for, is really clear, data-driven opportunities so that you can advise your brands, your clients, your partners, yourself, and how to make the best decision possible.
Well, thank you very much. And then so you pointed out there are some things that could be recyclable aren't, like, polypropylene cups you mentioned. But there are some things that there aren't conventional recycling streams for, like chip bags or ballpoint pens. And then to go for Tom for a second, your company's built around finding ways to recycle these and find end markets for those things.
Hey, Charlie, can I clarify though? Like,
sure.
Let's put the yes list with boxes, cans, cracker boxes, and in many places also polypropylene. So I didn't want those to be seen as a no. The other ones, I think it's really clear. We need that clarity of yes and no. And I think we should really talk about today is how check locally doesn't happen, but I just didn't want to give polypropylene a bad rap from the front.
Gotcha.
So sorry, Tom.
With you.
Oh, fully agreed.
So then let's take that out of the side for a minute. What about the stuff that's so far out of reach, like say chip bags, for example, ballpoint pens, toys, things that you're collecting and managing to successfully find end markets for?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to preface the statement by saying the best solution for products is to be designed, and this is what I think Keith has been talking about and advocating really brilliantly for a while now. And we agree with it as well, even though it technically would be anti-revenue for TerraCycle, is we believe local recycling is the answer. And only when something falls out of that opportunity do we step in and think about how do we collect and recycle it. Otherwise, it's how do we elevate it from a disposal output to a reusable output, which is our newest division. Now, the reason I think this is an important backstop on why things are not recyclable versus recyclable is the fundamental endpoint is whether it's profitable for a waste management company who's running that recycling ecosystem locally, which is why it's going to change locality by locality, country by country, if it's profitable for that actor to bother recycling it, right? In the end, the one actor who decides whether something will be composted or recycled is the end of life operator. They're the ones who make the decision. Everyone else can contribute to the process through good design, the manufacturer, the retailer by perhaps editing, educating, the assortment, consumers by voting in the right way and actually putting it in the bin. But at the end of the day, it's the recycler or composter that will make the final decision. And they are going to be, they're for-profit entities, are going to be focused on recycling what they can make money at. And so what we find is that the issue on some of the examples that you mentioned, toys, pens, and many, many products. And remember, let's not even just think packages. All goods end up in waste one day, right? All products, packages and products. So the question is, what happens? And the ones that are destined today, not for a recycling bin, are destined there typically because it's not profitable to recycle them today. And so The way our model works in that first division is effectively bridging the economic gap by getting a stakeholder, it could be a manufacturer, a retailer, a government, a location, to fund the actual cost of collecting and processing that waste stream versus what the results are worth. And the good news is we have found that almost everything, unless it's legally precluded typically, can be technically recycled. So that's good news. And then the question comes to, well, is it practical to do so? And that's entirely an economic question. You're on mute, Charlie.
Thanks, Tom. So you're solving that economic question by having brands, for example, and municipalities bridge that gap.
That's exactly right. And so we get a stakeholder to fund. It could even be direct consumer funding, right? But someone needs to say, I'm going to solve that economic gap. And now, national measures, which are more, have been passed nationally in, Europe and Canada and other places like EPR, deposit return schemes, EPR being extended product responsibility, help that. Don't always solve it fully, but absolutely helps. So they're wonderful things. But it's economic gap. Once you have solved the economic gap, then just, I don't want to say 100%, but just about everything can be technically recycled into something else.
Very cool. Thank you.
I think there's also opportunity here to think about the way that materials getting a second life can be part of your design process or your design intent. And so, yes, there's a cost to recycling, but there's also can be some financial gain when you're when you're going to use that recycled material in your product. So we know that using recycled content in the beginning does reduce your impacts. So if you want to use it, you also need to be part of the system that's creating that supply.
Right. So I mean, I know when we've talked in the past, that's been a number one. It's like, how can you use recycled material? It's having less impact to start, and it's also creating an end market, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Are there other? Oh, sorry.
No. I was just going to say that we often hear from some brands that they'd like to use more recycled content, but they're having trouble finding the right supply or a clean enough supply or in the right color. And I think when you start to think of the end of life or the recycling as a design challenge in yourself, by itself, getting involved so that you can design the product that you need to put back into your cycle is also a great way to control it and also to contribute. Yeah.
I'd love to build on what Fiona's saying, is that there's this really interesting challenge in the use of PCR or post-consumer recycled content, is that because we've designed our products from a virgin mentality, and what I mean by that is we've designed our products vis-a-vis what virgin plastic can do in characteristics of performance, but also price, we tend to focus on PCR that can get close to those characteristics. So if you're making something out of PET, like a t-shirt or a backpack or a soda bottle or a shampoo bottle, everyone tends to use municipally sourced beverage containers, because that is the closest in characteristic behavior to virgin plastic. And that's a challenge, because out of all those products I mentioned, the only one that would have been a closed loop process would have been the beverage container, beverage to beverage. But the t-shirt will not go back to a beverage container, nor will a shampoo bottle, nor will a backpack. And so this goes to Fiona's point, is we have to think not just about getting recycled content that behaves like virgin and like a substitution, but think about what materials are out there that people are not demanding. Like, take this as a joke, but design something from dirty diaper residue and start pulling demand there. And maybe that will start helping the solution, but also will look at design very differently. That's an extreme example, but take it from a hyperbole point of view.
So how do we, as designers, how do we find those sources of materials? How can we get better educated about what's out there?
Well, I think it's important to think about, if you're just thinking about it from a material trade-off point of view, I'm going to make this thing, and I'm either going to use PET or I'm going to use glass. Which one? Which one's the perfect solution? The answer is neither, right? So I think if you're going to be stuck in only the material trade-off world, you won't ever get a satisfied answer. If you pull back and you say, am I trying to design a bottle, or am I really thinking about the design and delivery of goods? How do I get something from one place to another? And I need it to be safe. I need it to be protected. I want it to have the lowest carbon footprint possible. And I'd like it to be part of a circular solution. I don't want it to end up in a landfill. material selection is part of that, but you have to think more holistically. I put into the chat 2 tools. If you're just thinking about plastics design, then there's the APR design guides. APR is the Association of Plastics Recyclers. That's a really good tool. If you're thinking about the trade-offs between one material and another, reuse, reducing, not even making it in the first place, and recycling, then Plastic IQ is a really good place for you to start. So as a designer, when you're tasked to create the most marketable package that's sexy on the shelf, that gets everyone's attention, and you're measured only by sales, you're going to have a really hard time communicating the trade-off of, guys, it's not just if I use a PET resin, I need to really think about the full life. That's where Plastic IQ can come in to help you. And I'm using these words because I feel like I need to confess that I'm married to a product designer. And so I hear these tensions, and and it creates for really interesting discussion too, over dinner when he's producing things and I'm trying not to. So it's good fun. But I think that's the challenge that you have, and you should use your design voice to be that reality check within your company to say it's not just about trade-offs, it's about a bigger system.
Thanks very much. I mean, I think that the idea about trade-offs and bigger system is great. Fiona, do you have any other kind of other thoughts about, you've talked about in the past about keeping that high value throughout loops?
Yes, definitely. So I think, as Keith said, it's not just about the material. We don't think there are any sustainable materials. We think it's about the system. And so understanding that certain colors, even of plastic, have a higher value on the secondary market is important to know. So using a fluorescent pink probably doesn't have a lot of secondary uses, whereas trying to maximize or trying to avoid finishes or colors that are going to make that plastic more difficult to recycle or less difficult to resale is really important to think of. So obviously clear or white plastics have higher value than the colors. And then the least value ends up being the grays or sometimes the blacks that are just a mix of everything. So I think that's one really important thing to consider. Also, the ways that you mix materials. So some really dreadful examples I've seen is putting a plastic shrink wrap over an aluminum can, which makes it really difficult to be sorted and to go through the existing infrastructure. I think that's a really bad design choice. So things like that, keeping materials as close to their mono materiality as you can is really important. And then also really thinking from the beginning what's going to have value on the secondary market.
Just to build, sorry, I keep building, Fiona, on your points.
Yeah, no worries.
This is sort of a good way to test the principles that Fiona and Keith have been talking about is call up not a packaging supplier, because you very well may get false positives, right, in the spirit of wanting to sell you things, but call up your end-of-life manager, a local recycler, and ask them not what can they do, but what would they do, right? Like if this shows up in the recycling bin. And a good way to stress test that is to say, hey, I have a full truckload of used widgets, whatever widget you're making. Would you like to buy that from me? And if they give you anything other than a yes, it's not going to be something they desire. And you need to feed the waste. Sorry, Charlie, you have to feed the waste what it desires, right? Like recyclers are not obligated to solve waste. There's this big confusion. I think the consumer thinks that recyclers are out there to recycle everything that's possible to recycle. Like there's somehow, like a government-run, sort of system or morally, ethically obligated to do it. They're for-profit companies. They're going to recycle only what they want to recycle.
I think that's a really important part. I talked to a lot of press, and they convey that they sometimes feel really let down by recycling. And I have to remind them that recycling is not a thing. It's a loosely connected, highly dependent network of moving stuff around. And it's only when we make the economics of making sure that recycling is a feedstock. It is a feedstock for manufacturing that has to compete on quality, quantity, and price. Only when that happens do you get the environmental impacts. Now, if you were going to design a system, come on, designers, if you were going to design a system that was circular, would you do it that way? That you have to make the economics all play out before you get to save the planet? That is a really weird thing. Now layer in the fact that I've just put this into the Q&A. There are 9,000 local recycling programs in the US. 9,000 programs that can take different things because different stuff is recyclable in different places and they're not obligated to. And even if we made 9,000 communities obligated to recycle them, they still, if they can't turn it into something new, it just doesn't happen. So we have to think about not the emotion of, do I feel let down, but really pull back and say, you know, what we're frustrated with is a linear system. We're frustrated with this free-for-all of producing things and wondering what will happen to it. What we want is data-driven clarity of, when I design this in this way, I know that this will be the outcome. What determines the outcome? Economics, collection, and the ability to turn it into something new.
So does that mean, and I guess this is a question for everybody here, that we're limited on the materials we use by the systems that are currently in place? And if we were to start introducing new materials, so we've got lots of stuff, bioplastics are coming in, which could potentially pollute PET streams and so on. Should we just stop right now? Should we be like, okay, no more new materials, because it's going to take 10, 20, 30 years for the systems in place to catch up?
I'll maybe start on this one. I think that you know, it's a very big challenge, this idea of new materials, because again, to Keith's point, like, recyclers are not responsible for anything. That's why this whole idea of being disappointed in them is odd, because it's like sort of, you know, feeling that there's a responsibility, right? It's a, you know, it's an enterprise that exists and offers a service, and you can use it if you want or not, right? It's as any other sort of, you know, enterprise. It's just somehow mischaracterized in this sort of public service point of view, because it serves such a good environmental opportunity. I think if you want to design into current infrastructure, which is what I would strongly recommend, yes, you have a much narrower palette, and there is a design challenge. I mean, you know, design challenges are given all the time, right? It's like paint a painting with fewer, you know, brushes, right? But, you know, that would be like clear, rigid PET above a certain size, you know, white HDPE, uncoated paper, and et cetera, et cetera. Keith mentioned many examples. I won't list them all, but, you know, those sort of examples. So a good example on biomaterials, right, is there, you know, biodegradable materials test incredibly well with consumers, right, and so on. But what's the only end of life manager that you should check is the composters. And how much access do Americans have to curbside composting today? And then, do those composters even want the material? And the way to do that is call them and ask, and you will be very enlightened to the answer. Now, if then you are still designing and your product requires a material that just, there's no choice, right? But you can't design into the system, then be aware of that decision. And you can solve for it by creating your own take back or circularity system on top of it, but at least be aware, right? At minimum, you know, understand that you're creating a gap, and then work on bridging that, you know, with short-term solutions that may be linked to like you doing it yourself through, you know, take back systems, all the way to advocating for more robust systemic solutions that will take time to implement. But be aware of it, right? Don't just design blindly and then say, why aren't the garbage companies figuring it out?
I think that's a really good point. And, you know, I think, Charlie, there's been a debate over the years of why won't recycling keep up with the innovation of production, of design? Well, let's know when does recycling happen? Recycling happens when a big enough pile of something like stuff can turn into something new that an entrepreneur can say, I can make money off of that. That's when recycling happens. And innovation, like, I'm going to take a very recyclable PET bottle, and then I'm going to put a full shrink sleeve label of it around it. But that shrink sleeve is a different material. Well, now the sorting mechanisms that look inside a MRF, the material recovery facility that separates things, that looks for those PET bottles to move it into the PET bottle line, can't identify it. You've created something that's so beautiful, but you've rendered it unrecyclable. The APR design guides can help you with that. I would love to build off of Tom's piece of, you know, well, if recycling just seems too hard, maybe we should pivot and look for something else. I testified last week with the House R&D Committee on Science and Space and Technology, and they were asking the question of what's the role of federal government in the R&D side. And of course, the question of composting always comes up. And when they think about it, what they're really saying is recycling seems really tricky. Can't we make it simpler? Can't we just make it compostable? Well, to Tom's point, do you know what there's enough composting infrastructure in this country to reach 4% of the US population. Well, you're not going to design something for a 4% chance that it can get back. And if it gets back, I love what Tom said. Does a composter even want it? I think it's important to think about the fact that recycling companies tolerate food waste to get packaging. Composters tolerate packaging to get to the food waste, but it's never nutritive. It doesn't help it. And when you start thinking about designing to prevent marine debris, you know, if it's in the ocean, it's a problem, whether it's degradable or not. Your job should be to design the thing that prevents it from ever getting there in the first place. When you take something that's recyclable, or, you know, any plastic, whether it's recyclable or not, and you put a degradable additive in it, you don't make it go away. You make it very small. You know what happens to very small things? It gets eaten by very small creatures that get eaten by bigger creatures, that then you end up with the same big plastics problem. It's just compounded, much like, you know, I think we're all familiar with mercury in fish. The same things happen. But I say this not to overwhelm you, but to say you should be really clear, design world, of what you need so that organizations like ours can give you science that you can lean on. So Fiona, I see you've unmuted. What do you think of that?
I was also going to say, as Tom said about getting involved, and you as well, like really finding out what the system is. And I think that designers have been really good in the other direction of looking at different material suppliers, supply chains, how things are shipped, how we sell things online. And so it's really just another way, like extending your design process into the end of life as well. And we mentioned something before, which is that recycling is really the last thing that we should be doing. It's lowest on the hierarchy of reuse, and it's lowest on the hierarchy of circularity. Looking at repair, remanufacture, reuse is really should come first before recycling. And I think that that's also something to really keep in mind. And these conversations are business ones. Circularity is a business decision, just the same way as you choose to sell online versus bricks and mortar. It's a business decision.
So recycling's in our name, and I completely agree with you, Fiona. Recycling doesn't make things guilt neutral. It still takes energy. It saves energy than producing from virgin materials. But I think we need to understand, back to that system solution, that there's still the creation of something that has to be managed. I spoke over you, Tom.
No. I hear. And I think the only silver bullet in sustainability is not purchasing. In fact, I think that's a critical thing we have to center on. Is nothing we're going to be speaking about here is the fundamental answer. Even reuse, which we've all agreed is the best on the hierarchy, is not as good as refusing. And this is very important, because if you think about the environmental trauma the world is living through right now, it's catastrophic across many, many vectors. Species diversity gone, 50% of it in 50 years. Deforestation. The state of our from a global warming point of view. Notice none of those are even waste issues. We haven't even gotten to waste, but Portland is melting today. Texas was freezing 6 months ago. That's just in the U.S. The point being is every one of those very, very important things, none of those even being a waste example yet, is all linked to the act of purchase. There is no benevolent purchase other than things you don't buy. And so the circular economy is not intrinsic sustainability. It is just honoring materials so that they keep going around. But intrinsic sustainability is balance with the earth, which can only come from a massive net reduction of consumption. And then let's make sure what we consume, because we can't live with no consumption, but we can live with a greater reduction in consumption, that consumption is now circular and much honors the materials, these amazing materials, to go around and around and around, right? And either, to Charlie's earlier point, the system, some actor wants them to go around because there's intrinsic value in them, or you have to figure out how to make them go around by creating a system yourself as a designer to make it go around, when the system that is there, that is not obligated to make it go around, chooses not to make it go around, right? So it's sort of, take this as an extreme joke. You want to get 100% recycling rates and 100% collection? Easy. Make your product from solid gold. You can litter it, and it's going to be collected brilliantly, right? If you're going to, as you reduce the value in the good, which is obviously, we're not going to make things out of solid gold, then we're going to reduce the chance of people wanting them. And then the more we're obligated to do it ourselves. But I think the biggest question in design is, how do we contribute to reduction? right? How do we make one product that can eliminate 3 products from existence, and so on, right? Like if you take the phone, I know it's criticized a lot, like a smartphone for, for the waste, the fact that it becomes waste every year. And that is an issue, the planned obsolescence in phones, but it did eliminate the need for so many other objects, to exist in our lives. We don't have alarm clocks now. We don't have home telephones, we don't have all these other objects that are now encompassed on a device that looks like this. That is a good example of elimination, right? And can we bring that philosophy in design to many other things? And then whatever that object is like this, let's make sure, like, many companies here, these are not curbside recyclable. You cannot put them in the blue bin, but there is a very robust system created to take these back and refurbish them and sell them. And it's a $1 billion industry on just taking these and refurbishing, right? So that's an example where a system outside the blue box system was created to solve it. And there's a great example of all those things coming into play simultaneously.
That was very informative. Thank you, everybody. And it also provides a nice segue to the next thing I want to ask. So, Tom, you talked about making things out of solid gold. And
yes.
If it was solid gold, whether people would recycle them or keep them themselves, it doesn't really matter. Like the material is not getting wasted. And maintaining that value. And Keith, you talked about the recycling system being incredibly fragmented. And it seems that kind of everyone has a role to play. In the past, a lot of that role has been pushed on consumers. Oh, you have this thing, it's your problem now. We sold you this thing, but it's now your problem. You need to recycle, or you need to not litter, or whatever. Now there's much more pushback saying, well, actually, there's things like extended producer responsibility. So actually the brand has to start thinking about this now. Or maybe it's bottle deposits or other ways of saying, what are the incentives to make it work for everyone? So I guess the question here is like, how can we make everyone work together? What are the kind of, I think, Keith, the Recycling Partnership talks about education, encouragement. What are the things that we can do to help make this easy for people? What are the things that we can do to make brands take more responsibility, if that's the right approach?
So I love the EPR question, because I think what it's asking for is how can we create consistency? And who's responding to who? Is design responding to the system? Is the system responding to design? Who's in charge here? And I think what we're understanding is we're peeling back the understanding of that there is no silver bullet. It's not just that we can teach the kids. It's not just that we can choose one material. It's not just that. We have to really work on a system where design is influencing the infrastructure is influencing the design, and there's enough cues going back and forth between them that we're evolving it, that recycling is in a good place when it continues to change, when more things are recyclable, because we see that bridge between what's coming in and where it can go. We're getting closer to a circular system. So I think it's important to think about this in a circle too, because who starts it? Everyone has a role. It's what's coming in. The consumer has a role. The infrastructure has a role. No one can do it on their own. And the EPR discussion helps to align that. I popped into the chat. If you guys haven't looked at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation just released 100 plus companies and 50 plus organizations that signed on to extended producer responsibility principles that says effectively, if you're putting things into the marketplace, you should, as a company, be responsible for paying to get it back. And I think this builds into a question that I see in the Q&A, Charlie, about who's in charge? Like, as a designer, I'm supposed to think about this, but really I'm responding to the customers. The customers are telling me what to do, or the marketing team, or there's someone else. I can only take it so far. I think pointing to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the investors of BlackRock, and pointing to a systematic change that consumers are responding to companies that do good and protect, not just sell stuff, is really important there. I agree, it's not just on you, designer, it needs to be on much more.
Just to build as well on what Keith has been saying, fully agreed, by the way. I think what I could maybe contribute to this is to share what are the effects of each of these topics that have been in the chat and we've talked about. So what are all the possible things one can do, right, to enable circularity? One is to move into higher quality materials, which are also typically synonymous with what materials recyclers want, right? Now that's going to be a cost per unit increase on a per widget built basis, right? You're just increasing the cost, and that's going to increase its chance of circularity. That's one. Two is you have legislative maneuvers, and legislative maneuvers tend to come into three major buckets. The first is EPR, as Keith was talking about, so extended product responsibility. The way those tend to work is that everyone pays it into a fund, so let's take Pepsi, right? Pepsi has, let's just simplify it to recyclable package forms like beverage containers and today hard to recycle pack forms like chip bags. Both those sides, the Frito-Lay and the Pepsi side, pay into the EPR fund. And then that is spread across the recycling infrastructure, which means the beverage containers, which are already profitable to recycle, their rates will go up. It's why Germany enjoys really high recycling of PET, aluminum, and so on. But the chip bags may not have been, they may have been such a negative that extra money still may move them not to positive and may still end up being not recycled. So EPR sort of rises the tide on the business equation, but it doesn't mean everything tips over to profitability, right? It just moves things up the hierarchy. So like polypropylene gets much higher rates when it may have been right at the edge. Then you have DRS, or deposit return schemes, or in the US, we call them bottle bills or equivalencies, that give a deposit back when you return an item. Those don't necessarily fund increase of recycling business equations, but they greatly always positively contribute to more collections because people are, monetarily incentivized to bring back the item, and always collection rates go up. The DRS always equals more returns. Then you have, and so those examples are a macro system cost per year, right? That you would, that the manufacturer would have to incur. US is a little soft on these. There's more discussion, very, very big. It's sort of like healthcare, right? Not really in the US, but everywhere else that's developed, right? That's the same with EPR and to some cases DRS. Then you have the third mechanism, which is, say, voluntary EPR, which is where you decide to create your own system to take it back. There you're funding whatever actually comes back, right? And you're paying the real cost of collection and processing minus value. Those are the major levers, right, in the toolkit. And reuse is a form of voluntary EPR, where you are building your own mechanism to bring it back. You're just not shredding and melting it, recycling, you're cleaning it and refilling it, reuse. But that would still be in the bucket of, call it, voluntarily creating your own mechanism, because there isn't right now a whole network of independent companies that are reuse operators. They're usually sort of closed systems because of the nature of reuse versus an open system, which is more like the nature of recycling. But those would be the tools in your tool chest to think about these various methods.
I also want to point out that 2 bills just passed in the US this week about extended producer responsibility. So Oregon and Maine, they're very different, but what they say is Oregon says we have a really good system, but it could be better if we all worked in the same place. Maine said we've got a long way to go. These are decades in coming. The US has been void of EPR policy, unlike much of Europe and Canada and some other countries. And so I just think everything is changing. So everything we're talking about today, we should probably do this again in 6 months and see what's changed, because it will have.
Yeah. I think also, Charlie, you asked a lot about what needs to happen. And I think Keith's report really outlines a nice blueprint for the types of infrastructure and investment we need. But I think we could also take advantage of consumers to help us create clean waste streams or clean streams. And I think you can observe this watching a child sorting anything, is that humans are really good at sorting stuff. So why don't we give them the opportunity or the systems so that they can sort the materials for us and keep the streams cleaner, which contributes to the higher value of that secondary material.
To build, by the way, statistics do show purity logarithmically goes up as you ask for tighter sortation, right? And consumers are willing to do it. We do have to think about convenience, right? But if you go into like some Nordic countries and you go to their waste depots, it's 65 sortations. And, people do it, and the quality goes up. So the economic equation gets better, and the net purity of the sortation tends to go up. And then we just have to balance that off with convenience to look at net volume.
Yeah. Yeah, because imagine a deposit on every single thing in the world, packaging or product. We'd have a pretty good chance that it would get back to where it needs to get.
Great, thank you all. I'm going to hand over to Peter now for a little while. We've got a few questions in the chat and in the Q&A, so I'll hand over.
Thanks, Charlie. I'm loving this conversation so far. I feel like we've been able to touch on just a broad variety of things. And also special thanks to Keith. You've been posting a ton of stuff in the chat. So I feel like a lot of our questions we've at least touched on a little bit. And I know we're not going to have a chance to get to everything. So, you know, plenty of handy links there if you haven't taken a look to go, kind of keep reading and dig deeper. One thing I have been noticing just across a lot of the questions we've been getting was around, you know, how do we really know like what the best materials are? You know, is it true that aluminum materials, you know, what about plastic? Is it true that kind of most plastics don't get recycled? If as a consumer, if I don't clean it, does that mean it doesn't get recycled? So I'm wondering, you know, I think we've seen a lot of links around education, but I'm wondering kind of how can we maybe help to dispel some of these common myths and provide a little bit more context, particularly given how fragmented these local systems can be?
Yeah, I wrote it in there. I kind of feel like I'm playing the link queen game. I'm over linking people by sharing too much, but I think there's really good resources. And so I hope I'm building your resource library. So I think this is a good time to talk about Plastic IQ. Plastic IQ gets to how do we democratize data around the trade-offs of one material or another, and reuse versus recycle versus compostability, for example, and have it in one central place that designers can use for themselves, but also for communicating with other departments within their organizations, their clients. It's all free. You have two versions. You can just play around with one, or you can create an account and hold it. When you create an account, that saves the data, so you can come back over time and you can really test out a portfolio. So you can start to play with the whole portfolio, and it gets to that question. So aluminum is a very recyclable material, but if you make something out of aluminum and it doesn't get recycled, it also has a much higher carbon footprint. So the trade-offs between, I want to step out of plastics and instead step into something that is not a marine contaminant in the same way, has other trade-offs with its carbon. And I think we have to have a conversation of waste is one thing, but climate change is another. Tom, I'm in New Hampshire. It is 93 degrees out right now in New Hampshire. You know, the climate question is really important into this one too. So that IQ tool is meant to bring the data that the Pew Charitable Trust worked with Systemic, UK-based, to build a Breaking the Plastics Wave report on really how do we stem all of this and turn it into something new. Those years of research is the same data that goes into this Plastic IQ tool, so you can do those sort of trade-offs. And if it was as simple as me saying to you, hey, look, from here on out, just use these 5 materials and you're golden, I would do it, but it's not that simple because we've got various trade-offs. You have to protect your, you know, a package serves a product to protect what's in it. And if we're thinking about it, one more thing, if we're thinking about it from like a climate point of view, sometimes, you know, if you've been in the grocery and you're like, why is that cucumber wrapped in plastic? Well, if the plastic makes the cucumber last a lot longer and get a fighting chance of getting eaten, not rotting and getting thrown away, then it stays out of the landfill, because rotting food in a landfill produces a lot of methane. And what's the worst climate bad actor? Methane. So here's the world of trade-offs, and this is what you're entering into. And I'm really proud of you for staying on this conversation for 46 minutes, because Fiona, Tom, and I have thrown a lot at you, and not all of it is simple. None of it has been simple, but that's the whole point of why we need a system, no silver bullets.
I think it's also really important to measure where you are, because you can't really manage anything if you haven't measured it. And I think keeps pointing out that there are tools out there to help you start to measure what you're doing or how you could be better. And then, yeah, there are certainly some material changes that you can make, certain things that you should avoid. As I said earlier, try not to permanently mix materials. So gluing things together that can't be separated. Using finishes that affect how the material is sorted in the MRFs, or how it's read, or how it could be recycled. I think that's really important. And then, yeah, as we've said before, working with existing streams. So I think there's a lot of exciting material developments coming in biocoatings for pulp and paper that allow them to have the barrier properties of wax or plastic films, but allow them to be repulpable or compostable, so they could work in a few different streams. And then we're seeing lots of processes that could give you the same aesthetic effect as a paint finish would, but without using paint. So I think there are lots of things out there that can start to be substituted, but it really is a systems problem. It's not a material. Materials are part of it, but they're not the only thing to consider.
Awesome. Fiona, I think there's a good segue there with what you started with around kind of ways that companies and designers can do better. And I've noticed a lot of questions around, as a designers in a company, we might be, kind of reporting to someone above us who's dictating a certain thing, or maybe R&D's got a certain, focus, and we kind of have to sway to certain needs of the different groups in the company. In terms of like business, brand, corporate leaders, if you want to transform your company, it could cost a lot. That could be a big, investment to transform how your company operates. What sort of incentives are there to do that beyond maybe kind of the marketing or the green credits, the greenwashing of it?
I'll start. Oh, so please, Fiona.
Yeah, no, please, Tom.
No,
please.
go for it.
I was just going to say that it doesn't have to cost. And so I think that materials have value. And sometimes the reclamation of those and being part of that system to reclaim them can also create a revenue stream. So it doesn't have to be cost, but I think there are lots of figures to be looked at, but it doesn't have to cost.
So I was going to just add that I think Fiona's absolutely right. Now, just to take the other, what if, right? It does, because there's the duality of that side, and I preface to say fully agree, is a trick we've used, right, in this, and this is sort of a secret sauce of what we've been able to achieve in our company, is find value outside the obvious. So what I mean by that is, where else can you attain business benefit that's traditional and can be measured and celebrated? So it's not to convince the stakeholder you're designing for to change their point of view, right? Because that's very, very hard, right? If they care about market share and profit margin and those things, fine, so be it. But there are many other ways to tease out value in something that may be on the surface more costly, right? Does it help drive customer acquisition? Does it help drive retention? Does it help drive incrementality at retailers? Does it help drive loyalty of staff, et cetera, et cetera? And there's a lot of these things that can be very interestingly teased out. So maybe the design object doesn't just come, here is the widget, here is the thing, but here is the way you can bring value around it. So I'll give you just one example, if I may, to make it not academic. Many times, we talked earlier in this discussion about PCR being, the focal point being things that are characteristically synonymous with virgin, like municipally sourced beverage containers because of their price performance and characteristic performance. So then ocean plastic or plastic from inner cities or all these other areas that are being polluted, those are not being used because they tend to cost more and produce an inferior quality compared to, say, virgin. But those are examples where if you say leverage the narrative of that particular supply chain, you see this happen in ocean plastic a lot, for example, that moves the heartbeat of the consumer, the customer, like the retailer, and it becomes a really strong vehicle that then allows the company to justify the higher cost and even potentially the lower performance, because it's getting other value. Like in that simple example, it's getting marketing value that you would have had to buy anyway and pay for pointless advertising, right? That's not moving the world forward. So it's just an example, not to say that is a silver bullet, but you see the example of teasing value. And if you tease other value, then the economic equation can still be smart, even if when you look at it on the surface, it may look more expensive.
Awesome, thanks, Tom. I think there's one last question here that I think would be interesting to just talk about, and this is a little bit more lighthearted and more around inspiration. Are there any brands that you think are getting this right? Anyone, whoever's got a thought.
Yes, I think there are companies that are making big strides. I think we have to define what right is. Are you designing for the system that was? Are you building a better system for all the things that will come? If I'm so tempted to put another report in the link, but As You Sow is an organization that ranks companies on how they're doing against their pledges around packaging things. And I think that's a good place to look at. But when I hear a company make a commitment, I really look at what is the action and how much are they putting on the table. So the report that we just wrote that says, what is it going to take to fix recycling, not just for the traditional things, but we're talking like for films and flexibles, the packaging that is in your house, the thing that is in my trash can right now, that we as humans, when we play the role of consumer, have in our cart, virtual or in person, that's going to cost $17 billion to fix the US system. But we could do it in a decade, and it delivers immediate carbon and job and environmental impacts that we can measure. I don't see anyone contributing the $17 billion to build a better system and design for it. So I see significant steps from companies. And then I see companies who are taking it a step further and working as competitors, putting together bands of competitors and saying, we can't fix this on our own. We're all in this bin together, and so we better design for it. So I see more progress than I ever have. I've been in this space for more than 20 years. I ran a program, I worked for the state, I worked on the private sector, and now, that's why I built this nonprofit. It's because there was not an action agent who was saying, companies, we need you to be at the table, and communities, you need to be at the table, and we just have to put all this together. And so that's why we designed and built the recycling partnership to do that. And in 7 years, we put more than 1 million new recycling carts on the ground. We've raised more than $150 million. We put right back into grants for local governments, for MRFs. We're working on design, we're working on end markets, and we're working with 2,000 local governments in the US. That's exciting progress. And if we keep that up, we will make sure that every American in this country has a recycling cart in no less than 126 years. Is that the timeline you want? That's not fast enough for me. So I'm super impressed. I'm super proud of what we've built and what we've done. And but I think that we have to have a reality check that it's going to take billions, and it's going to take a shift in this mentality that I can just put anything out there and then we'll cross our fingers that something good happens. I think we as people need to make sure that we're only buying and we're insisting that the things that come out into the world have a plan. Even if that plan is to end up in the landfill, we just need a plan. I think it's greenwashing if we hope for the best. We either need to know that it's landfill bound or it's circular, and that's it.
I think there are a lot of examples of people doing really, really good stuff. And as Keith mentioned, I think putting your commitments into actions is really important, rather than in 2050, all of our packaging is going to be sustainable. Is what does that mean? And what are you doing this year? What are you doing next year? And I think there are a lot of examples across not just packaging, but a lot of consumer products where they have gotten more definitive about what they are actually doing and admitting perhaps where they could do better or what they're trying to improve upon. And yeah, I think it's been refreshing to see a lot of companies sharing information even with their competitors, because I think there is, yeah, that they're not these evil companies not wanting to do the best for the planet, that I think that that's not really the case. And yeah, so I think as someone who's kind of in it, it's heartening. It's not all doomsday. It is, there's things are changing, which is, yeah, hopeful.
So then maybe I'll wrap this up, and just with maybe a bit of a hopeful outlook. So if things go well, if maybe we don't get the $17 billion that we need for recycling, but things are on an upward path. I mean, Keith, you've already talked about things being very different in 6 months. And maybe I'll start with Tom. I mean, are you going to be out of business in a decade if things go well, or like how does that, like, if things go well in 10 years, what does it look like for you?
I hope so. At least our TerraCycle division, I would love that. It's a reaction to a problem. In fact, it's why we created Loop, which is our reuse division. And just take this as an academic point. Loop is fundamentally cannibalistic to TerraCycle. Loop is about a reuse ecosystem. TerraCycle is about solving non-recyclable waste. TerraCycle shouldn't exist if we design away from it. And Loop is a spirit to even help forward that over, right? Is to push it along, right? It's just like Netflix's streaming service killed its DVD service. And I think everyone at Netflix applauded that to occur. And I hope the same occurs, and I'm doing everything I can to achieve it. I think, though, that we have a gargantuan issue that's growing, and we have some big headwinds to contend with. Headwinds are things like oil prices oil prices cut in half in 2015 and haven't recovered. That's horrendous for recyclers. End markets have gone away due to countries not importing waste as they used to. They did that for good reason. There's no debate from my end on why they stopped importing. But if you're a recycler in Pittsburgh, you lost 40% of your end markets overnight. And those haven't recovered because those materials don't have the demand in the US. They have the demand in Asia, right? So again, the logic for why it was done is very sound, but look at the effect on recyclers. And then you also have the quality of the waste that we're feeding recyclers is challenging. What's the biggest mega trend in packaging? Lightweighting, reduction of value. It just makes things objectively less desirable to be recycled. And there's a lot of headwind. We do need to help this infrastructure that we are, to Keith's earlier point, somehow holding morally responsible for a problem we're creating. We got to help them out a bit. And that help means designing into what they want, helping pass legislation statewide, hopefully federally, like DRS, like EPR, and continuing to design, with that open mind. And I think then we'll have a chance to, to create that output. And I would cheer it on all day long.
Yep. So if we level up the system, I think we can do it in a decade with the right investments, but it pays it back. $17 billion into recycling by our measurements is easily $30 billion of new economic gain. And that's in jobs and material sourcing and manufacturing. Again, recycling is creating feedstocks for manufacturing. That's all about jobs and planetary protection. So I'm not concerned about this work going away. I think the questions that I see on this conversation is great. It's everything from how fragile is recycling? If I put the wrong thing in, is it all messed up? No, it's not quite that cut and dry, but it does make it more expensive, all the way up to how do we affect polymer levels to make them more rigorous for long-term recycling? The answer is we need all of that and everything in between. And it comes back to really, what is our social license to produce things at will? And does that social license give us the ability to really feel disappointed if it doesn't all magically come back into play? I think we have to ask for a better system that comes from companies and brands, but it also comes from chemical companies that create the polymers, that create this material. This isn't just a plastic issue. We've talked a lot of plastics here today, but every material has its challenge in recovery. But I want to end on a note of hope. I've never seen a moment in time where the public interest is so high, corporate interest so high, policymakers are finally here. The fact that I testified last week is an indicator that they are thinking very different things. I think there's an opportunity to really put that into play. And just like Tom, we're cooking every single day to do as much as we can. And if in 10 years, the country has $30 billion more and I don't have a job, I am so cool with that.
I think from my perspective, because of the material background, I think that there is a need for greater material awareness and knowledge, not just from designers, but I think from consumers. And I do think we are seeing that change. And I think greater awareness of the materials around you will affect how we value them, how we consume them, and what happens to them post-life. So I think we are seeing that changing, and hopefully that's even more, because materials are pretty awesome. So yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that. I mean, I think there's been a lot of great information, great links. So thanks to all three of you. From Tom, the better than reduce, reuse, recycle is a refuse. Just don't put it out there in the first place. If people do want the convenience that Keith alludes to, don't imagine it's going to go nowhere. There is education required. Understand the materials, understand what they can be done, and designing appropriately, I think is the face. So thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today. I'm afraid this Zoom's going to, the second Peter hits stop, it's done, and I don't get a chance to thank you again afterwards. So thank you so, so much. This has been absolutely fantastic. Thanks everyone for joining us. We have another salon coming up in, actually, let me just pull up my notes here, in about 3 weeks' time, I believe. It is called Personalizing Today, Unlocking Personalized User Experience. And more information at go.smart, blah, blah, blah. It's the link's in the website, go.smartdesign.worldwide.com/VSS and once again, thanks to everybody for joining us today. Looking forward to seeing you again soon. And we'll post a summary on the website. Thanks all.
Thanks, guys.
Okay. Bye-bye.